There is a map in the southern cabinet that I permit no apprentice to file without supervision. It is an accomplished thing in the narrow technical sense. The coastlines are neat, the bays are measured, the rivers are indicated with obedient blue veins. Soundings are scratched into the margins in a merchant's practical hand. Little compass roses bloom where the cartographer wished to flatter himself. Ports are named in dark ink, and inland regions are washed in a patient green that pretends to know what grows there. One might praise it if one were a customs clerk or an admiral with no imagination for being serviceable. Ethically, however, it is a disgrace. Across the great green body of Chult, the mapmaker has written a single, sweeping label in a hand almost jaunty with confidence. Wilderness. That is all. No sacred roots, no remembered boundaries, no old cities with names spoken in reverence or fear, no tribal grounds, no holy river bends, no warnings worth the reader's moral improvement, no acknowledgement that people had lived there, prayed there, fought there, buried there, judged there, and been judged there long before the first northerner arrived to mispronounce a harbour and ask whether any profitable ruins lay inland. A homeland had been reduced to a blank invitation. So I keep the map beside a maze token of black stone said to have come, in elder years, from Mesro. Whether that provenance is genuine, I will not swear. Archivists who swear too often become collectors of fakes. But it is a useful pairing. The chart says, empty enough for appetite. The stone says, you are already inside someone else's pattern. That, my apprentice, is where we begin tonight. Welcome back to the Hidden Stacks. I am Aurelian Cantonine, Faerûn Lorewarden, keeper of old roads, old shrines, old ports, and the less flattering truths travelers prefer to omit when they return home with cargo, stories, and the conviction that discovering a place is the same thing as understanding it. This is the Lich's Tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. We remain in our second season, Realms Between Ruins, the Long Age of Kingdoms. In the first season, we crossed the grand sweep of Faerûn's making, the contradictory dawn stories, the creator races, cataclysm and remade geography, the dominions of dragons and giants, the first flowering of the elves, the crown wars, the making of the drow, the founding time, the rise of dwarven and human powers, Imaskar and its stolen peoples, Netheryl's ascent and annihilation, Myth Dranor's bright gamble, the persistence of borderless factions, the time of troubles, the spell plague, the second sundering, and the precarious breathing space of the present age. We asked how Faerûn became Faerûn. This season asks who inherited it. We began by refusing the fantasy of empty land. We stood amid the ashes of older orders and said that later realms are rarely first builders. They are heirs, trespassers, scavengers, restorers, deniers, and opportunists. Then we turned to Jamdath and saw that disciplined thought itself could become empire. Then to Mulhorand and Unther, where gods became not merely objects of worship, but the architecture of administration. Then to Chesenta and Chondath, where the Vilhon Reach taught us that markets and militias are often less opposed than polite civic rhetoric suggests. Then southward into Kalimshan, old enough to make many younger realms look theatrical in their claims to antiquity. Then to the Shun Imperium, where expansion hardened into habit and empire survived its own death in titles, roads, and reflexes. Last time, we examined Amn and Tethyr, those neighboring failures of legitimacy, where coin sought sovereignty and bloodline failed to become peace. Tonight, we sail still farther south. Not to an edge of the world, though some Western charts persist in drawing it as one. Not to an exotic annex of other people's adventures, though tavern tales have long tried to force it into such humiliating service. We go instead to one of Faerûn's sternest rebukes to provincial history. Tonight we enter Chult and the southern sea roads. Our thesis is this: Chult is not an exotic margin, but a center of memory, danger, sacred geography, and maritime consequence that northern and western chroniclers have repeatedly misread. To call it wilderness is often not description at all. It is confession. The speaker means only that he does not know how to read a land whose order is not arranged for his convenience. We will speak of jungle kingdoms and holy cities, of Mesro and the disciplined sanctity of Ubtao's chosen, of the tribes and peoples who made Chult a homeland rather than a rumor, of Omu and the rot that enters prosperity when greed begins asking for slaves, of Ras Enzi and the tragedy of zeal turned monstrous, of markets and harbours, of pirates and sea lanes, of tribute paid to powers in the bay and taxes paid to powers ashore, of foreign merchants who arrived with ledgers in one hand and misunderstanding in the other, and of the old violence committed by maps that call a place empty simply because its people have arranged it under meanings outsiders cannot easily monetize. You should expect correction. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. In a world full of structures hastily erected, badly documented, ornamented beyond reason, and left to future caretakers with a smile and no instructions, it is a pleasure to recommend builders who understand that durable systems must remain usable after growth, stress, traffic, and the vanity of interested parties. For clear, maintainable web design and development, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. A harbour that cannot take weather is merely scenery. A site that cannot survive real users is merely architecture's version of flattery. Now then, let us begin not with a port, but with a refusal. When a northerner says of Chult, "It is all jungle," what he usually means is, "The things I was taught to treat as evidence of civilization do not appear often enough for my comfort. There are, to be fair, jungles, vast ones, thick as stubborn thought, wet as newly spoken prophecy, noisy with life, death, courtship, hunger, warning, and those innumerable territorial disputes by which the natural world reminds civilizations that they are not the only institutions capable of organizing force. But Chult has never been merely vegetation. It is a peninsula of rivers, uplands, coasts, bays, interior basins, old volcanic fire, sacred roots, hidden settlements, ruined cities, dangerous shrines, tribal territories, beast-haunted grasslands, mountainous barriers, and sea-facing points that matter not only to those who dwell there, but to the wider economies of the south and west. The land itself argues against simplification. To the north lies the Bay of Chult, where river mouths and harbour approaches shape what can be entered, taxed, protected, or preyed upon. The river Soshenstar and river Tiriki help define the approaches to the great northern port. Inland run other waters and older paths, among them the river Olung, by which Mesro was set, not accidentally, into a sacred and strategic relation with the country around it. To the south and center rise deeper jungles, cliffs, hidden basins, and places where an uninvited traveler may discover that being off the road is not the same as being the first soul ever to tread there. To the west and east, coasts and inlets open toward the trackless sea and the larger southern maritime world. And above all stand the peaks of flame, smoking and severe, a mountain chain that is not merely a geological fact, but a theological wound stitched into the land's memory. If you begin there, much else follows. For Chult was not given in older traditions to a distant, inattentive divinity. It was awarded to Ubtao as his sole dominion in exchange for vigilance over the terrible threat of Dendar the Night Serpent, imprisoned beneath the peaks of flame. Consider what that means for a people's imagination. In many lands, theology explains harvest, death, weather, kingship, or fate. In Chult, theology is also custodianship over catastrophe. The land is not just fertile, dangerous, or beautiful, it is watchpost and burden. The mountain is not merely scenic, it is sealed menace. The world there is labyrinthine, not because that is poetically pleasant, but because life itself is understood as a pattern one must learn without ever assuming the beast at the center is dead. This makes Chultan sacred geography different from the temple-centered pieties many foreign chroniclers expect. The jungle is not the opposite of sanctity. The jungle is one of its forms. A river crossing may be a ritual site. A hidden city may be a covenant. A maze is not decoration, but doctrine. A dinosaur's tread may be read as one of Ubtao's signatures. To live in such a land is to inhabit a holiness that is territorial without being tidy. It is one reason outsiders so often misread Chult. They keep looking for stone where the meaning has been distributed into water, canopy, beast, and path. And yet stone is there as well, just not always where foreigners expect to find it. In the oldest coherent human traditions of Chult, some of the tribes later central to the peninsula's history were led by Quatls from the Dark Continent to meet Ubtao upon the peaks of flame in -2809 DR. Among those remembered in the stronger records are the Eshoe, the Tabaxi, and the Thinguth. Pause, if you would, over that older use of Tabaxi. Here we speak not of the later catfolk wanderers known elsewhere by that name, but of the ancient human Chultan people who became one of the great tribes of the peninsula and the guardians for long ages of Mesro's order. One of history's smaller cruelties is that words survive while certainty changes costume. Be precise, or the dead become ridiculous through no fault of their own. These early tribal histories already reveal what makes Chult so ill-suited to outsider reduction. It was never a single city pretending to be a country. It was never a simple cluster of villages waiting to be centralized by someone with better maps. It was a homeland of distinct peoples living within a sacred and dangerous environment under a divine pattern that did not erase local identity. The Eshoe were powerful, the Tabaxi were powerful. Other tribes and lineages moved, fought, traded, intermarried, and remembered differently. Some old inland peoples, such as the Lapal in the eastern jungles, endured longer histories of oppression under serpent powers before flight or transformation reshaped their descendants elsewhere on the peninsula and beyond. To say Chult is therefore to name both a geographic unity and a human plurality. The same coast, the same peaks, the same god, and not the same people. Foreign empires dislike such complexity. It complicates the tax roll. The older ways of life in Chult do not resemble the urban presumptions of Mulhorand, the mercantile refinements of Kalimshan, or the hard-road consciousness of Amn. Tribal communities often moved when poor jungle soils were exhausted. Families traveled in smaller units. Hunting, gathering, limited cultivation, and adaptation to local terrain mattered profoundly. Non-metallic weapons remained common because iron and steel were scarce, and the few imported by foreigners never came in quantities sufficient to arm the whole land. Each family might have one wielder of arcane power, not because Chult lacked aptitude, but because arcane magic was often feared, constrained, or ritualized differently than in more mage-tolerant cultures. Dinosaurs, those magnificent reminders that the world does not always evolve toward human preference, dominated the predator hierarchy and were revered by many as aspects or signatures of Ubtao. You may hear in this the ignorant outsider's temptation to say, "Ah, primitive." Do not embarrass yourself. Adaptation to local ecology is not primitiveness. It is literacy in the conditions of survival. A people who know which valleys flood, which plants heal, which beasts can be driven, which sounds in the night are warning, and which merely boastfulness, which ruins attract what kind of scavenger, and which paths anger, which spirits possess, a sophistication no imported steel automatically supersedes. The northern merchant who sneers at such knowledge tends to die before he finishes the sentence, leaving behind excellent boots for someone more observant. This is one of the central errors in the Chultan case. Outsiders often mistake material forms familiar to themselves for the only legitimate evidence of order. Because many Chultans did not saturate the peninsula with walled stone towns, iron-armed levies, and heraldically obsessive estates, those outsiders concluded the country was underused. They did not ask whether other forms of territorial intelligence were in operation. They merely brought axes, surveyors, and accountants. But before the accountants came in force, there was Mesro. Ah, Mesro. A name that draws moths to the imagination even now, though many who speak it have learned the word from treasure maps, sensational chapbooks, or those nauseating accounts of lost cities written by men who imagine a city becomes lost when it stops being available to them. The city was founded by Ubtao in -2637 DR, if the strongest traditions and later harmonized histories are to be trusted. Its temple and amphitheater, say the old accounts, he raised directly from the chaos of the jungle. This is not just pious ornamentation. It tells you how the Mesroans understood the city. Mesro was not merely built in Chult. It was articulated from Chult. Its sacred center was not an alien imposition upon the land, but a revealed order within it. That distinction matters. Many cities define themselves by their victory over surrounding nature. Their walls proclaim, "We have excluded the wild." Mesro did something subtler. It organized the wild into civic pattern without pretending to abolish it. The city stood along the river Olung, using the river as border and lifeline. Thick jungle pressed close. The city itself was circular and quartered by broad avenues running from the temple of Ubtao at its center. Agriculture, residence, market and scholarship were all given distinct spaces. Farms and groves produced bananas, cassavas, nuts, papayas, plantains, sorghum, yams, honey, and medicinal plants. Dinosaurs walked even in those cultivated quarters, not as tokens of feral intrusion, but as part of the place's lived texture. The residential quarter formed a maze of simple houses and sandy byways. The market quarter held craftsmen, hostels, inns, smiths, and the amphitheatre, where law, performance, and public life mingled. The Scholars' Quarter contained the library, schools, training grounds, and colleges. Every child, in later accounts at least, was educated in literacy, history, and mathematics. Do you hear what I'm saying? Mesro was not only a holy city, it was an argument. It argued that sacred order could produce urban life without severing itself from jungle reality. It argued that education need not belong exclusively to guilds and hereditary elites. It argued that memory deserved institutions. It argued that ritual authority and practical administration could coexist. It argued that a city need not be built upon contempt for its surrounding land. There are many places in Faerûn that deserved more thoughtful heirs. Mesro is among the greatest of them. Its government was theocratic, yes, but again not in the exact mode of Mulhorand or Unther. Mesro was ruled by the Barai, the chosen of Ubtao. 7 in number, they were granted unique powers and enduring life. These were not merely priests in ornament, nor were they simply kings borrowing sacred language. They were guardians of covenant, embodiments of the city's continuity, keepers of law, memory, and protection. Tabaxi warriors patrolled the streets. Punishment for grave crimes could be severe, but many offenses were judged through compensation rather than indiscriminate brutality. The Temple of Ubtao stood at the center, 9 stories and golden domed in later descriptions, containing the Hall of Champions and the audience chamber from which rule was enacted. The amphitheatre formed the center of cultural life, a place of recitals, plays, and races. The library preserved centuries of Mesroan memory in text and artifact. There are cities older than Mesro in the world. There are richer cities. There are cities with taller walls or larger ports. But few more clearly reveal what it means for urbanism to be an extension of sacred geography rather than its negation. It is no wonder that foreigners loved to misunderstand it. Some arrived and saw treasure. Some saw an anomaly. Some saw a holy place and wished to translate it into their own categories so thoroughly that they might own it while claiming reverence. Some, being of the species accountant, saw the same things and asked whether the temple lands could be assessed more rationally. There is no blasphemy quite so tedious as bureaucratic blasphemy. Yet Mesro was not all serenity, and Chult was never Eden before the first foreign sail appeared on the horizon. Beware histories that make a people innocent simply because later outsiders wronged them. Chultan history has its own ambitions, fractures, zealotries, and brutalities. We honor a people more by granting them full history than by embalming them in virtue. The long conflict between the Tabaxi and the Eshowe proves this well. The Eshowe were one of the great Chultan tribes, powerful and formidable, second only to the Tabaxi in some old reckonings. In -438 DR, the year of dripping daggers, a terrible civil war began between them and the Tabaxi. It endured for nearly 3 centuries. Think on that. Not a raid, not a dynastic squabble, Not one of those 6-month crises later courts like to call civil war, because 6 months felt unbearably long to people accustomed to regular dinners. 300 years, generations born inside enmity, children raised to inherit unfinished injury, memory hardening into structure. Immortal peoples are not the only ones who know how to make hatred durable. Near the end of this struggle, in -137 DR, the year of blooded sunsets, the Eshowe somehow loosed the ancient shadow giant Esho Dao, the so-called Shadow of the Eshowe. It attacked Mesro itself. Here, Chultan sacred history acquires one of its darkest turns. For Esho Dao was no mere battlefield weapon. In some traditions, it represented the dark aspect or antithesis born of Ubtau's own divided essence, a profound shadow attached to the very act of creation. Whether one accepts the more theological version or a later doctrinal development, the effect upon the historical imagination is the same. The civil war culminated not only in bloodshed, but in a near-apocalyptic assault upon the holy city by a figure of primordial negation. Esho Dao nearly ruined Mesro. And then, like so many summoned disasters, it punished even those who had called it. It turned upon the Esho and annihilated much of their strength. One feels, reading these accounts, the old lesson repeated with monstrous clarity. Powers summoned in hatred do not always maintain good discipline afterward. Then came Ras Ensi. Ras Ensi is one of those figures the realms produces with malicious generosity. A defender, a patriot, a servant of sacred order, and a catastrophe made flesh by the refusal to stop when duty has already curdled into obsession. He was one of the 7 original Barai, one of Ubtau's chosen. In later ages, he would be remembered as the creator of much of the undead horror that roamed Chult. But that memory can flatten the deeper tragedy if one is not careful. Ras Ensi did not begin, so far as the records suggest, as a cartoon of villainy. He began as a guardian of Mesro, a man to whom the city's protection had become indistinguishable from absolute vengeance upon its enemies. After Esho Dao's attack, Ras Ensi sought to slaughter every last surviving Eshoe in punishment. There is no gentler way to say it. He crossed the boundary between defense and extermination and did so fatally, while persuading himself that fidelity to Mesro required the crime. For this, the other Barai exiled him. That act of exile is one of the most important moral moments in Chultan history. Mesro, sacred though it was, did not permit its own defender to redefine justice as extermination without consequence. A holy city proved willing to punish its zealot. Hold that beside the long histories of other states where men who kill effectively for the regime are excused until they become inconvenient. Mesro's standard was higher. It was also perhaps politically necessary. A city that had just survived near ruin could not survive the sanctification of limitless revenge. Ras Ensi, however, did not become harmless in exile. He became worse in scale and more inventive in method. Later traditions remember him commanding vast undead forces, imposing tribute through terror, stripping the jungle of lumber to fund his ambitions, trading in slaves and timber through the sea routes, and maintaining enough spies that few could move through the larger ports and villages of Chult without risking his notice. That progression matters. Exiled zeal does not always collapse. Sometimes it becomes entrepreneurial. And here the Chultan story joins one of the grimmer patterns of Faerûn. When sacred legitimacy expels a fanatic, the fanatic does not necessarily vanish into shame. He may learn commerce, he may learn ports, he may learn to monetize grievance, he may even persuade himself that all of this remains, in some twisted sense, an act of love for the city that cast him out. How many tyrannies have called themselves disappointed loyalty? Rasensi's afterlife in the history of Chult is therefore not only necromantic or military, it is economic. He is one of the figures through whom we see that the jungle, the coast and the sea lanes are never separate worlds. An exile inland can still reach the shore. Timber cut in rage still becomes cargo. Slaves seized in the interior still become profitable if there is a beach, a ship, and a foreign buyer willing to insist that the matter is regrettable but commercially routine. The southern sea roads do not merely connect cultures. They transmit local sin outward and import foreign appetite inward. Keep that in mind, because it is the spine of tonight's second half. Before we take the ships, however, we must linger longer in Chult itself, for Mesro was not the only city that matters, nor was Ubtau's presence always translated into humane order. Consider Omu. Omu is often presented to later generations as a forbidden city, which is true enough if one likes the sort of phrase designed to be whispered by paid guides beside a campfire. But beneath the melodrama lies a highly instructive political history. Omu was not merely a hidden ruin in a basin. It was a prosperous Chultan city built atop rich veins of minerals and gems. Omuan jewelry traveled widely, commerce enriched it, mining sustained it, power accumulated. Its rulers and elites discovered, as elites so often do, that prosperity can begin by serving the city and end by teaching the city that nothing it desires ought remain unpurchased. The Omuans began demanding slaves from neighboring peoples to work the mines. Their armies marched outward. Wealth turned predatory. The city ceased to understand abundance as blessing and began treating it as entitlement. Ubtao, according to the most persistent accounts, did not tolerate this indefinitely. Sometime in the 13th century DR, he forsook Omu. The city's clerics lost their divine power. The slaves revolted. The city fell into ruin. And then, because fallen civilizations rarely content themselves with a dignified silence, the survivors turned to the 9 trickster gods and remade their religious life in forms much less stable, much less cohesive, and much more vulnerable to later corruption. What interests me is not merely the moral punishment story, though that is plain enough. What interests me is the structural lesson. Omu demonstrates that Chult's sacred order was never a simple blanket spread evenly across the peninsula. Chultan cities could diverge sharply in political character. Mesro represented covenantal sacred urbanism disciplined by guardianship, memory, education, and a center that remained answerable, however imperfectly, to a vision of balance. Omu represented sacred blessing degenerating into extractive greed. Both were Chultan. Both emerged beneath the shadow of Ubtao. Both prove that local civilization in Chult cannot be reduced either to noble simplicity or picturesque ruin. The same homeland generated cities of very different ethical tenor. That, too, is sophistication. Indeed, one of the quiet insults embedded in outsider depictions of Chult is the refusal to grant it internal variation. To many foreign chroniclers, There is only jungle and danger, with perhaps one useful port and several admirable piles of old stone to be investigated for personal advancement. But Chult contained distinct peoples, cities, cults, economic zones, sacred territories, and moral traditions. Mesro was not Omu. Omu was not the scattered tribal communities of the interior. The Ashowe were not the Tabaxi. The old serpent-haunted eastern reaches told different historical stories than the northern bays. Ports did not think like inland holy cities. Holy cities did not think like mining polities. Yet all of it is flattened by the outsider gaze into a single sweaty blur called exoticism. It is a contempt born of insufficient distinctions. Let us make some of those distinctions properly. In the older Chultan life world, the relation between settlement and land differed sharply from that of many northern realms. A northern chronicler might imagine civilization as fixed fields spreading outward from stone keeps and market towns, with wilderness beginning where tax records thin. Chult does not reward that assumption. Soil depletion, heavy rains, predatory wildlife, sacred terrains, and practical adaptation all encouraged more mobile and regionally attentive forms of life. Settlements might shift, families might move. Metallurgy remained less central than in iron-rich lands. Local arcane practice could be feared, constrained, or secluded. Dinosaurs and other formidable creatures remained integrated into the environmental and spiritual imagination. The result was not instability in the crude sense. It was a different kind of territorial intelligence, where a Cormyrian magistrate might ask, "To whom does this village owe tax?" A Chultan elder might more profitably ask, "Who knows this stretch of river, this season of the hunt, this path through the growth, this shrine's temper, this predator's route, this story's warning?" The former question produces ledgers. The latter question keeps people alive. Daily life, therefore, must be imagined accordingly. A hunting party learns not merely where prey passes, but which clearings ought not be camped in because some older story still clings there. A family shifting ground after soil exhaustion is not demonstrating lack of attachment, but obedience to the land's actual terms. Weapons are chosen for climate, material reality, and local need. Metal scarcity shapes fighting styles, trade relations, and dependence upon outsiders for certain goods, which in turn shapes power. Arcane aptitude is managed socially because magic in a dangerous environment can become catastrophe faster than in a well-policed wizard realm. Religion enters practical life not as occasional festival alone, but as pattern recognition, taboo, guidance, and vocabulary for reading events. Even architecture must answer rain, heat, insects, beasts, and spirits. It is tempting for sedentary empires to see such adaptation as evidence that the place has not yet achieved civilization. That is because sedentary empires confuse resemblance with development. And Chult, perhaps more than most regions, punished that confusion. Now we can take the ships. The southern sea roads are among the most consequential and least romantically understood networks in Faerûn. The romantic version, written by people who do not pay crews and have never watched a cargo spoil because a magistrate delayed departure for ceremonial reasons, speaks in vague phrases of warm winds, bright waters, and exotic commerce. The actual version speaks of hull maintenance, tides, storms, Reef knowledge, convoy timing, pirate calculations, harbour dues, disease, provisioning, interpreters, tribute, marine hazards, and the constant arithmetic of whether one more day in port will enrich or ruin the voyage. The shining sea, arm of the trackless sea, carried immense trade and traffic across its breadth and was busier than much else in the western waters. Kalimshan lay to the north. The Tashala and the southeastern shores drew their own commerce. Chult sat out in the sea as island way station, intermediary and problem. The Chultan Peninsula jutted southward like a thick green argument into all these movements. To pass its waters or make use of its ports was not a minor regional matter. It was one of the ways the South conversed with itself in goods, rumours, priests, mercenaries, foodstuffs, luxuries, and lies. This is important because Chult was not only a land foreigners misread, it was also a land foreigners needed. Its exports in later summaries are listed almost with insulting brevity: furs, gems, ivory, perfume, teak wood. One may add to that broader patterns of rare herbs, hides, jungle products, hard-won lumber, and the innumerable local valuables that never quite settle into a Clark's Clean category. Its imports included food, jewelry, and weapons, which immediately tells you something about the relationship between ecology, manufacture, and outside dependency. Where metal is scarce and the jungle exacting, foreign steel acquires political weight. Where the interior produces beauty or rarity prized abroad, foreign demand begins pressing itself into local life like a coin into wax. Trade, then, was never innocent. To the outsider, Chult offered wealth in forms the broader sea world desired: ivory, exotic timbers, perfumes and resins, gems, curiosities, access, contracts. The very difficulty of the land increased its glamour. A cargo from Chult could be sold not merely as useful, but as storied. Markets adore danger once someone else has survived it on their behalf. To the Chultan, the sea roads were something more complicated. They were avenues of exchange and risk, means by which necessary goods arrived, avenues by which unwelcome ideas, diseases, predations, missionaries, pirates, and investors arrived, and also theatres in which local agency had to be defended constantly against foreign confidence. A port is never only a market, it is a border where interpretation becomes policy. This helps explain why later Chultan organizations such as the Waitepka Society cared so much about controlling the loading and unloading of ships, watching foreigners, and preserving what they understood as the natural and social order of the land. Even before later periods of formal colonial pressure, Chult knew perfectly well that the dock is often where conquest first learns to smile. And then there was Aramag. I confess a certain grim affection for the old dragon turtle in the Bay of Chult. Not because he was benevolent, he was not. Not because he was civilized in any morally edifying sense, he was not that either. But because his continued demand for tribute from ships entering or leaving the bay demonstrates with unusual candor a truth many kingdoms prefer to hide under better tailoring. Every trade route is governed by something that exacts payment. Aramag did it honestly. He rose from the waters, enormous, ancient, and ill-tempered, and required treasure or lives. Captains who wished to pass carried tribute. Merchants factored him into cost. Pirates sometimes provided captives. The bay developed not despite him, but around the necessity of accounting for him. There is a barbaric elegance in that. Compare it with a harbour bureaucracy that taxes a ship 6 different ways, while insisting the arrangement is a mark of civilized order. At least the dragon turtle did not issue receipts and call extortion public service. Yet here again, the Chultan case is instructive. Local people understood the bay through this reality. Foreign merchants adapted, grumbled, paid, and went on profiting. A maritime hazard became part of the route's political economy. Trade does not require safety. It requires predictable enough danger to price. Now widen the lens. Northwestward and westward, ships connected Chult to Tether, Amn, Kalimshan, and the broader western coast. Southeastward and eastward, routes interacted with the Tashalar, Lapalia, the great sea-facing lands, and the complicated southern reaches where serpent powers, merchant oligarchies, city leagues, and old cultures intermingled. Tashluta, in the Tashalar, for example, became home to the vast Rundine Trade Consortium, which controlled nearly all trade passing through the city and dominated commerce across Kalimshan and the Chultan Peninsula for centuries. Observe what that means. Chult's maritime life did not exist in isolation. It was embedded in a southern commercial web where oligarchs, syndicates, city powers, and merchant houses all sought to convert geography into durable advantage. Ports breed institutions suited to repetition. A successful harbour cannot survive on improvisation alone. It requires dock labour systems, storage, local law, interpreters, pilots, guards, brokers, and people whose entire skill consists in knowing how strangers lie differently depending on what they are trying to unload. The southern sea roads therefore produced not merely wealth, but particular types of person, harbour factors, navigators, coastal raiders, customs officers, guides, translators, local fixers, religious intermediaries, shipwrights, supply agents, and those gifted parasites who can arrange almost anything at a port except honesty. Chult participated in this world, but never wholly on terms set by others. That is what foreign empires and merchant powers found so irritating. A place that exports valuable goods but resists becoming merely a source of cargo always provokes fantasies of correction. The correction may take the form of missionaries who decide the local gods are poorly organized. It may take the form of explorers who rename features already named. It may take the form of armed companies claiming to bring security while measuring timber first. It may take the form of tax regimes imposed by powers that insist their accountancy is a gift. Or more subtly, it may take the form of stories. Stories are often the cheapest scouts of empire. Tell the world a place is savage, mysterious, lost, dangerous, and full of treasure, and you have already recruited half the trespassers you need. Chult suffered greatly from stories, not from its own. Its own stories could be severe, tragic, and demanding, but they belonged to the land's moral ecology. No, the more corrosive stories were imported. Chult as a picturesque hazard. Chult as the place where brave northerners test themselves. Chult as old ruin awaiting rediscovery. Chult as storehouse of rare goods inconveniently occupied by locals. Chult as margin. The margin lie does especially fine work for exploiters. If a place is a center in its own right, then those who enter must negotiate with its histories, claims, and authorities. If a place is a margin, then entry becomes intervention, intervention becomes management, and management becomes entitlement. The same harbor now appears to invite control. The same ruin now appears ownerless. The same people now appear picturesque rather than sovereign. This is why naming is political even before the soldiers arrive. And the soldiers did arrive. Long before later formal colonial control, foreigners used Chult's coast and bays for furtive landings, extraction, and private schemes. Port Castigliar, that absurd little beachhead with the grandiose name, is worth mentioning precisely because it is so unimpressive. A handful of huts, a supply depot, a graveyard already more populous than the settlement's prospects, and the sort of self-regarding explorer mythology only wealthy uncles can subsidize. Why bother naming such a meager place? Because it reveals a recurring foreign instinct. If one cannot dominate the whole coast, one plants a tiny claim and a memory of ambition, hoping posterity will mistake intent for accomplishment. Small beachheads often tell more truth than great fortresses. A fortress can pretend inevitability. A depot of 7 huts cannot. It admits what the foreign presence actually is: tentative, opportunistic, dependent upon local ignorance or indifference, and deeply invested in making its own insignificance sound historic. Yet beachheads can grow, or rather they can be folded into larger patterns. Port Nyanzaru offers the clearest case. In later centuries it became the major trading center of northern Chult, built on the Bay of Chult at the mouths of the Soshenstar and Tiriki, a place of walls, color, docks, markets, and formidable commercial energy. But to understand Nyanzaru properly, one must resist treating it merely as the inevitable urban future of Chult. It was instead one possible answer to maritime pressure. It arose at the point where local commerce, foreign demand, geographical convenience, and the necessity of mediating between inland danger and seaborne opportunity produced a city that could face outward without wholly abandoning the interior. That balancing act is arduous. A city facing the sea must deal with strangers daily. It must bargain, defend, classify, tax, and improvise. It must allow enough foreign presence to remain prosperous while preventing that same presence from becoming ownership by habit. It must find local elites capable of using external appetite without being wholly used in return. Many ports fail this test and become little more than decorated funnels through which the wealth of a hinterland drains into someone else's treasury. Port Nyanzaru spent long ages trying not to become one of them. Its later merchant princes, those commercial magnates whose council ruled the city, are sometimes lazily compared to Amnian oligarchs. The comparison is not wholly false, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. Yes, their power rested on wealth. Yes, they managed foreign relations through profitable alliances. Yes, they delegated much of the city's daily running and could be inefficient or self-interested. But they were also operating within a profoundly Chultan problem: how to keep a port city alive, useful and wealthy while the jungle remained deadly, foreign companies remained hungry, and the wider sea lanes kept insisting that access ought eventually to become authority. This is why later Amnian control over Port Nyanzaru is so historically revealing and so depressingly predictable. Amn asserted colonial control in Chult during the late 14th century DR. By the late 15th, and its trading companies controlled mercantile activity in the city. Taxes grew heavy. Residents outside the orbit of major companies were crowded toward shantytowns. Corporate rivalries mattered as much as civic obligation. Adventurers were recruited not out of romance, but because jungle dangers, rival companies, and local resistance all required deniable expertise. If you listened only to Amnian commercial rhetoric, no doubt the arrangement sounded like stabilization and rational management. It always does. What it actually meant, in human terms, was that the city's safety from the surrounding dangers became something sold back to its own people. The old pattern again. Foreign power arrives offering structure, then invoices the locals for having been inconvenienced by occupation. And yet, Chult did not simply accept this forever. Later, in the 1480s DR, a consortium of Chultan traders backed by the Vitebka Society helped wrench Port Nyanzaru back to independence. The 7 merchant princes rose and ruled in council. Note the local answer to foreign domination. Not a return to some imaginary, untouched innocence, but a Chultan commercial sovereignty shaped by the very pressures foreign trade had imposed. The city adapted. It remained a port. It remained outward-facing. But the claim to speak for Chult within that outward-facing world returned, however imperfectly, to local hands. I do not romanticize merchant councils. They have many of the vices one expects when wealth becomes office wear in brighter fabrics. But there is a difference between local oligarchy and colonial company rule, just as there is a difference between being cheated by your own ambitious cousins and being told by a distant power that cheating you is a development strategy. Even so, Port Nyanzaru should not mislead us into thinking all Chult desired to become a mercantile bay city modeled after foreign success. The city's very exceptional prominence in outside accounts has distorted perception of the whole peninsula. Chult is not Port Nyanzaru plus scenery. It is a much older and wider world within which Nyanzaru is one maritime answer. Remember Mesro, remember Omu, remember the tribal communities of the interior, remember the old Eshowe, remember the serpent-shadowed histories of the eastern jungles, remember the wild dwarves, the lizard folk, the goblins, the terrafolk, the nagas, the beasts, the river systems, the sacred mountains, the hidden valleys, the local shrines. A port is a mouth. It is not the whole body. And yet mouths matter. They are where the world tastes you. What then did the world taste when it came to Chult? First, wealth. Second, danger. Third, otherness convenient enough to market. That combination is intoxicating to outsiders. A merchant from Kalimport or Athkatla can sell teak and ivory, certainly, but he can also sell the idea that the goods come from a place of dinosaurs, cursed cities, god-haunted jungles, and difficult passage. A noble collector does not merely acquire carved wood. He acquires a story about distance, peril, and exceptional taste. The more the source can be represented as wild or lost, the less the buyer must think about the people whose lives made the extraction possible. That is the violence of misreading in one of its gentler, more profitable forms. Not all violence enters with swords. Sometimes it arrives as a vocabulary in which local life becomes atmosphere. Consider the word ruin. In foreign hands, it is wonderfully promiscuous. A ruin is anything old, stone-built, and available for projection. Yet, to the local inhabitant, the same site may be ancestral memory, sacred remnant, cautionary proof, taboo ground, burial place, unfinished covenant, or a spot better left to its current snakes. To call it ruin without further thought is already to reposition it morally. It becomes open to adventure. That is to say, open to intrusion. Or consider the word wilderness. As I said at the beginning, this often means only that outsiders do not recognize the systems in operation. The jungle may indeed be perilous. So is the Underdark. So is the sea in winter. So is a plague-struck city. Danger does not prove emptiness. It proves that the world was not arranged primarily for your convenience. Or consider the phrase, lost city. Lost to whom? Omu was lost in part because its own people destroyed maps and signs of its location after collapse. Mesro in later ages was lost only in the sense that its protectors chose invisibility or removal over availability to predators and fools. A city may be absent from a foreign chart and still remain terribly present in local memory. To say lost often means, again, unavailable to us. And this linguistic violence is no trivial matter. Once a people have been turned into picturesque adjuncts of their own land, once their histories have been reduced to guidebook color, it becomes easier to justify external management. The harbor must be secured, the ruins must be catalogued, the timber must be organized, the labor must be improved, the tribal arrangements must be rationalized, the sacred geography must be translated into something taxable. By the time soldiers arrive, the story has already softened resistance in distant minds. The southern sea roads carried more than cargo. They carried these stories too. From Kalimshan came old habits of wealth and layered hierarchy, plus a long familiarity with turning coastal access into civilizational leverage. From Amn came sharper forms of commercial sovereignty and the belief that profitable routes naturally desire Amnian supervision. From Tether and the western ports came adventurers, fortune seekers, missionaries, and the entire chattering apparatus of those who think maritime knowledge consists mostly in surviving seasickness while someone poorer does the rowing. From the Tashalar and other southern powers came their own mixtures of trade, competition, oligarchy, and coastal self-confidence. From pirates came a more candid form of appropriation. From slavers came the ugliest calculus of all. Chult met them all. What does Chult look like from the deck of an arriving ship? To the foreign eye, first the heat, then the color, then the unnerving sense that the coastline does not care whether you have come prepared. The wharfside smells are never merely salt and tar. They are fruit, rot, rain, animal musk, timber sap, hot stone, spice, wet rope, fish oil, and the faint medicinal tang of things gathered inland by people who know which roots matter. The voices in the port carry accents and languages the newcomer does not yet sort correctly. Shields of hide and local weapons appear beside foreign blades. Dinosaurs are not painted decorative absurdities, but practical presences. Bargaining is not a theatrical prelude to trade. It is one of trade's truths. Priests, dock workers, guides, guards, factors, sailors, fishmongers, and those dangerous little children who can identify gullibility at 20 paces all move through the same streets, with that effortless competence which makes newcomers feel both excited and ridiculous. To the local eye, however, the scene is read differently. Which ship has paid proper tribute in the bay? Which captain lies when he says his cargo is small? Which passenger is actually a factor for a foreign consortium? Which priest brings faith, and which brings survey instruments disguised as benevolence? Which guide is good enough to survive the jungle, and which merely has an excellent voice for stories? Which adventurers are disciplined, which are loud, which are doomed, and which are the especially dangerous type that mistake confidence for preparedness? Which trader knows the local etiquette well enough not to cause insult? Which one assumes gold excuses every error? Which stranger is actually two strangers under one story? Ports teach this double vision. No wonder Chult's coastal politics grew watchful. The Witebka Society, also called the Triceratops Society, deserves more than a passing mention here because it represents a quintessentially Chultan answer to distributed pressure. Later, it would be known especially in and around Port Nyanzaru, but in the mid to late 14th century, it maintained a presence across Chult, with members in villages and ports, a network of communications, and a singular purpose: to protect the natural and social order of the land from disruption, especially at the hands of hostile foreign factions, pirates, explorers, and the more destructive varieties of adventurer. Note the phrase, natural and social order. That is not merely law in the narrow city sense. It is a local statement that land, people, custom, and survival are interconnected. The Witebka were not simply customs inspectors or patriots with a secret handshake, though they could be those as well. They were guardians of interpretive sovereignty. They watched the docks because the docks are where local order is most vulnerable to being renamed. They left warnings to those who disrupted that order. They corrected behavior, fined offenders, and in severe cases enacted harsher punishments. Later generations compared them to the harpers, which is not wholly foolish, but the comparison obscures their more rooted character. The harpers imagine balance across wide regions. The Witebka imagine Chult remaining legible to itself. There is a lesson there for students of power. Large empires defend borders. Merchant oligarchies defend roots. Sacred cities defend doctrine. But lands under constant commercial and exploratory pressure must often defend meaning itself. If outsiders can redefine what the place is for, then every later bargain begins from foreign premises. The Witebka understood that. They were archivists of order in a land where no single throne could manage every coast, ruin, village, and path at once. This is one of the reasons Chult fascinates me. It repeatedly generates institutions that are neither quite kingdom nor quite faction, neither quite tribe nor quite city-state, but adaptive guardianship mechanisms suited to a land too old, too dangerous, and too exposed to be governed by imported formulas. Mesro was one such mechanism. The Barai were another. The Witebka became another still. And even the port city merchant princes, for all their appetites, may be read in this light when contrasted with foreign company rule. They were not simply local versions of Umne. They were a Chultan adaptation to maritime capitalism under jungle conditions and historical memory. Foreign observers tend to miss this because they keep asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, why does Chult not resemble our preferred model of the state? They ought to ask, what kinds of order emerge in a land where sacred geography, difficult ecology, dangerous wealth, and foreign appetite constantly intersect? The answer is plural kinds, not always admirable, often tense, sometimes violent, frequently improvisational, yet real. This is why I have no patience for narratives in which Chult is simply a backdrop for outsiders. Backdrops do not develop layered maritime strategies. Backdrops do not produce holy cities, secret protective societies, divergent political traditions, and city-specific moral collapses like Omu. Backdrops do not resist colonization, absorb trade, export rare goods, and continue to generate local agency under the pressure of foreign companies and armed adventurers. Backdrops are painted cloth. Chult bleeds when cut. Let us look more closely at what the southern sea roads actually do to a region like this. First, they accelerate selective visibility. A thing that can be loaded onto a ship becomes visible to distant markets. Ivory, timber, perfume, gems, medicinal plants, trained guides, maps, stories, even dinosaur hides or curious relics. Once shipborne, they enter other people's imaginations. A thing that cannot be loaded or easily sold often becomes invisible to those same markets. Sacred obligations, soil exhaustion, grief attached to a shrine, the practical knowledge of avoiding a certain valley at dusk. The moral cost of labor conscription. The local history explaining why no one trustworthy sleeps near those ruins in the rainy season. Thus, sea trade teaches foreigners to see commodities and ignore conditions. Second, the roads redistribute power inland. Where a port thrives, inland paths toward that port become valuable. Guides gain influence. Intermediary settlements matter more. River crossings become bargaining sites. Local leaders who can guarantee or obstruct movement gain leverage. So too do raiders, undead tyrants, or hidden cults able to tax, terrify, or reroute traffic. One reason Ras Ensi became such a consequential threat is that inland terror could be converted into coastal revenue when timber, slaves, and stolen wealth reached Refuge Bay, and from there the wider seas. Third, the roads intensify the politics of translation. Every port needs brokers who know both local and foreign expectations. Such people can become indispensable, wealthy, corrupt, or patriotic in complicated mixtures. They decide how a local taboo becomes a negotiable inconvenience, how a foreign demand becomes a local compromise, how much a stranger must pay for ignorance, and whether a misunderstanding should be corrected or quietly monetized. Translation is never only linguistic. It is legal, ritual, and moral. A Chultan guide who tells a foreign adventurer, "Do not touch that shrine," may be preserving the client's life, the local order, and the guide's own reputation all at once. A foreign factor who says, "Surely this can be arranged," may be announcing trade, sacrilege, and a bribe in the same polite breath. Fourth, the roads make piracy and private force inevitable collaborators in regional history. A maritime network rich enough to matter is rich enough to attract predation. The southern seas and coasts have never lacked for pirates, raiders, slavers, and opportunistic captains willing to distinguish very carefully between what the law calls theft and what a distant patron calls pressure. If an inland city cannot field a navy, it must bargain with someone who can. If a merchant prince wants a rival delayed, a pirate may suddenly discover commercial logic. If a coast is thinly defended, raiding becomes seasonal arithmetic. The southern sea roads therefore blur the boundary between commerce and violence until only the most sentimental historian pretends they are separate spheres. Chult did not escape this. It suffered it, used it, resisted it, and was defined by it. Fifth, and most corrosively, the roads teach distant powers to imagine that familiarity with a coast equals knowledge of a land. This is perhaps the central Western error regarding Chult. A captain who has anchored in the bay thrice and visited the port market believes he knows Chult. A merchant who has purchased teak and ivory from Chultan intermediaries believes he understands the country. A missionary who has baptized 2 dock workers and translated a proverb badly believes the local faith is nearly deciphered. An adventurer who marched one route inland and survived a ruin believes he has seen the jungle. This coastal arrogance is not unique to Chult, but Chult punishes it with unusual thoroughness. Beyond the harbour, the map ceases flattering the visitor. Beyond the city walls, the social order changes grammar. Beyond the first hired guide, the land begins asking questions no foreign training prepared you to answer. Which is why so many foreign texts about Chult are simultaneously vivid and stupid. They describe the color of market awnings and the terror of a night howl, yet remain morally illiterate about the place itself. Let me be more specific. A northern or western chronicler often notices the visible surfaces of Chult immediately. Bright port colors, unusual weapons, dinosaurs, vines upon walls, the smell of spices, the drama of old ruins emerging from green overgrowth. He then converts these observations into atmosphere, but atmosphere is not analysis. The YKLWA is not merely picturesque. It reflects material conditions, fighting style, and cultural adaptation. The dinosaur is not merely a delightful absurdity. It is part of local economy, transport, symbolism, danger, and reverence. The vine-draped ruin is not merely scenery. It is a political fact, a historical wound, or a sacred remnant. The colors of the port are not decorative excess. They are civic self-expression under sun and salt, and often under watchful gods and watchers both. Reduce these things to atmosphere, and you have begun the old theft, taking the signs of a culture while refusing their meanings. This is why I keep that disgraceful map in the archive. It is a teaching instrument. It reminds us that bad history is not always false in its measurements. Sometimes it is quite accurate in distance and utterly corrupt in interpretation. There is another misconception to dispel before we move toward our conclusion. Chult is often imagined in Western telling as though it were culturally and historically sealed until foreigners learned to sail there with sufficient confidence. Nonsense. Chult has long been part of a wider southern conversation. Look eastward along the peninsula and you find the Tashalar, with its merchant oligarchies, mixed populations, shipyards, perfumes, spices, wines, and the great port of Tashluta. There, the Rundain Consortium turned trade itself into governance, controlling virtually all commerce through the city and dominating business across Kalimshan and the Chultan Peninsula for centuries. Look farther, and you find older Nepal histories, human peoples once oppressed by Yuan-Ti powers in the eastern jungles before flight and transformation scattered descendants into the Tashalar, Halruar, and beyond. Look across the sea, and you find Kalimshan's layered urban appetite. Look north and west, and you find the western coast's growing hunger for southern goods. The southern maritime world was never a set of isolated beads on a string. It was a net, and Chult was one of its heaviest knots. This matters because it shifts the question from when did Chult enter history to the much better question, which outsiders were listening badly enough to miss the history already underway? Take religion again. Foreign observers love to report Chult as a land of Ubtao, and that is correct as far as it goes. But the region's religious life has always been more textured. Ubtao's dominion mattered enormously. Ashodao emerged in relation to that sacred history. Thard-Ha found worship among some inhabitants. Omu's later trickster cults flourished after Ubtao's withdrawal. Serpentine powers lurked in parts of the peninsula and around its eastern reaches. Later port cities saw the presence of deities such as Warkeen, Gond, Savras, Suna, and Timora in practical maritime life. A port where foreign merchants arrive constantly will always grow a more complicated pantheon than an inland holy city. This is not dilution. It is contact, or take ethnicity. The Chultan identity itself includes older tribal distinctions and later urban formations. Tabaxi, Eshoe, Thinguth, and others are not interchangeable. Nor are Chultans identical with Tashalans, though the peninsula links their histories. Nor are local peoples reducible to foreign-imposed names. One of the consequences of maritime trade is that outside ethnonyms and inside self-understandings begin colliding constantly. A foreign scribe writes one label over 3 peoples. A local speaker uses one word for a land and another for a lineage. A port official must decide which system to apply to incoming agreements, tax obligations, or disputes. Over time, these collisions shape politics, marriage, alliance, and misrule. Or take the matter of labor. In some foreign imaginations, Chult is all hunting bands and vanished cities. Yet ports require labor concentration. Timber extraction requires organized work. Markets require carriers, builders, cooks, guards, paddlers, sailors, interpreters, and sellers. Foreign companies always look upon such labor and begin calculating how to discipline it more profitably. Local societies look at the same labor and ask how to keep it within existing moral worlds. The conflict between those visions is one of the underwritten dramas of Southern history. It is easier to narrate a dragon or a lost tomb. It is harder to narrate the dock worker asked to serve foreign capital under local sun while being told this is progress. I prefer the harder history. Consider also how Chult affected the broader imagination of Faerûn. For Western children, Chult became the place of stories too large for immediate verification. Dinosaurs, ancient curses, hidden cities, undead in the jungle, gods who walk through stone, dragon turtles demanding tribute, guides who knew impossible paths, merchant princes in bright ports. This fabulous reputation created a feedback loop. The more Chult was imagined as a place of wonder and peril, the more adventurers came seeking exactly that, which in turn reinforced the outsider narrative that Chult existed chiefly as a testing ground for adventurers. But from within Chult, the same phenomena read differently. Dinosaurs are not all wonder. They are herd, meat, transport, hazard, symbol, and weather made flesh. Ancient cities are not all mystery. They are inheritance, warning, proof, and temptation. Undead in the jungle are not all thrilling. They are failed justice and ongoing blasphemy. A dragon turtle in the bay is not all legend. He is a line item in shipping calculations and a reminder that power at sea may be toothier than any customs house. Merchant princes are not all colorful personalities. They are revenue systems with wardrobes. Do you see the difference? Outsiders consume the dramatic surface. Locals pay the cost of its persistence. This is why I insist on centering local perspective, even while using records many outsiders preserved. Without that discipline, one accidentally writes not the history of a place, but the history of other people's reactions to it. And Chult deserves better than reaction history. Let me pause here for something like praise. Not sentimental praise. Chult has suffered enough of those from men who arrive with admiration in one hand and ownership papers in the other. I mean praise in the historian sense, acknowledgement of civilizational achievement. Chult sustained sacred traditions of remarkable coherence around Ubtao and the Peaks of Flame. It produced Mesro, one of the most conceptually distinctive cities in Faerûn. It generated multiple forms of local order adapted to difficult land and recurring foreign pressure. It maintained valuable maritime connections without becoming merely a maritime appendage. It developed protective societies able to think beyond ordinary civic law. It held cultural memory in place despite civil war, divine withdrawal, undead terror, foreign exploitation, and the long market tendency to strip a place down to what can be shipped from it. Even where Chult's histories turned cruel, as in Omu's descent or Ras Nsi's crusade, they reveal a mature internal politics rather than the blankness outsiders once projected onto the region. This is not a trivial accomplishment. Many lands become easier to describe only because catastrophe has simplified them beyond justice. Chult remained difficult. Difficult lands preserve truth by refusing lazy summary. Still, difficulty has costs. Local resistance to outsider misreading can shade into suspicion of all foreigners, and not without reason. A port society cannot afford innocence. Traders, explorers, missionaries, and treasure hunters have done too much damage for trust to remain cheap. Secret oversight becomes tempting. Warnings become ritualized. Distinctions sharpen between those who belong, those who are tolerated, and those who are being studied quietly in case they need correction. Foreigners, in turn, interpret such watchfulness as hostility, never noticing that they themselves arrived with their own assumptions of entitlement and classification. Thus, Chult's defensive sophistication becomes, in the foreign tale, proof that the place is dangerous, even politically. So be it. Some places should be hard to exploit. There is also the question of memory and shame. Every civilization chooses what parts of its past to spotlight and what to soften. Chult is no exception. Mesro shines in memory, as it should. Omu darkens it. The Eshowe War haunts it. Rasensi stains it. The surviving presence of powers tied to a Shodao reminds the peninsula that internal hatred can leave residues as enduring as foreign domination. The old serpent legacies in parts of the peninsula and beyond remind local peoples that not all threats came by ship. The ports remind them that not all threats came from inland either. Thus, Chultan memory is burdened from both directions. Jungle and sea alike can deliver unfinished trouble. A wise people do not romanticize either frontier. That double burden gives Chult much of its particular moral atmosphere. In some realms, the sea is freedom and the interior is danger, or the reverse. In Chult, both can nourish and imperil. The bay brings trade and tribute. The jungle brings homeland and hazard. The holy city offers order and the possibility of zealotry. The port offers wealth and the possibility of subordination. The old ruin offers memory and plunder. There is no clean geography of innocence, which, I confess, is one reason I find Chult so intellectually honest. It does not permit one to pretend that beauty and danger reside in separate districts. Imagine, if you will, a merchant voyage beginning in Kalimport or Athkatla and pushing southward toward Chult. The ship leaves a harbour already layered with legal obligations. Cargo is loaded according to destination, risk, and expected return. Wine and worked goods here, metal there, perhaps jewelry for the ports, perhaps coin, perhaps religious trinkets no one would openly call missionary equipment until safely offshore. Crew are counted, provisions checked, storms considered, pirates priced in. The captain has one story for the authorities, another for investors, and a third for his own conscience if he still troubles to keep one. As the vessel moves along the coast and then outward, every league increases both promise and exposure. There are islands and hidden inlets where raiders may wait. There are rival merchants in other ports who would be delighted if this cargo arrived late. There are reefs, weather, sickness, mutiny, incompetence, and that universal maritime truth that salt destroys all complacency given enough days. By the time the ship nears Chultan waters, the crew have become a temporary society bound less by affection than by shared calculation. Then the bay approaches. Now the voyage acquires a different sort of intelligence. The ship must know how to approach the Bay of Chult, what tribute has been set aside for Aramag, which pilot is trustworthy, whether the harbour authorities are presently friendly to this flag, which foreign companies are ascendant. What rumours of inland trouble might affect pricing, and whether the goods one carries will fetch more sold honestly, semi-honestly, or through back corridors no decent magistrate would acknowledge while privately taxing the results. A captain ignorant of these things is not bold. He is cargo for someone else. Upon arrival, the goods disembark into a city that does not simply receive them, it judges them. Who is buying? Local traders, foreign houses, intermediaries for inland settlements, agents of some merchant prince, temple suppliers, black market networks. And what must move inland in return? Guides, pack animals, porters, interpreters, permits if such things are being observed at the moment, gifts, warnings, information, perhaps contracts for lumber or ivory, perhaps hunting parties organized around foreign demand, perhaps an escort because the road or river route has become unsafe owing to undead activity, pirate spillover, tribal tensions, or a ruin suddenly fashionable among adventurous fools. Do you see how a single port transaction unfolds into a whole political ecology? This is why I resist the tourist language of trade. Trade is not a colourful exchange of niceties between mutually fascinated strangers. It is a demanding web of extraction, dependency, negotiation, adaptation, and occasional genuine curiosity. The ship from Kalimport does not merely bring goods, it brings the expectations of Kalimport. The local harbour does not merely sell access, it filters what sort of relationship the sea world will have with the land beyond. And if the local harbour fails that task, the hinterland pays. There are lands in Faerûn whose internal life can ignore the port for months at a time. Chult is not one of them. The southern sea roads ensured that even inland histories eventually felt maritime pressure. A rise in demand for teak or ivory changes what is cut, hunted, guarded, and fought over. An influx of foreign adventurers seeking a rumoured ruin changes the value of guides, the danger on inland routes, and the temptation for local intermediaries to sell knowledge that may not be theirs to commodify. A foreign company's interest in mining or timber changes which paths are kept, which river landings are used, and who is bribed or killed to secure them. The coast converses with the interior, whether the interior enjoys the conversation or not. Here then, we reach one of the episode's deepest concerns. What is the moral difference between using a road and claiming the land it passes through? Empires are notoriously bad at perceiving the distinction. Merchant companies are worse because they convince themselves they are innocent, where empires at least still enjoy the pageantry of guilt. Yet local peoples know the difference intimately. A caravan path used by agreement does not erase prior claim. A river route does not confer ownership upon the first foreign factor to profit from it. Hiring guides does not transform guidance into surrender. Purchasing cargo from a port does not make the interior a blank extension of your market. Chult had to teach these lessons repeatedly because the sea kept delivering students who believed themselves professors. I can hear the objection from some clever Western listener already. But surely, he says, trade brought benefits as well. Metal, goods, ideas, wealth, perhaps even protection. Must we condemn all exchange because outsiders were arrogant? No, that would be childish, and the dead deserve better than childish moral arithmetic. Exchange is not the problem. The problem is asymmetry disguised as inevitability. When Chult imports food, weapons, or worked goods, that is exchange. When foreign traders begin treating dependence upon those goods as leverage for political control, that is something else. When local ports choose outward commerce to enrich themselves, that is governance. When foreign companies decide the profits entitle them to rule labor, territory, and law, that is something else. When adventurers pay local guides to reach a place under agreed conditions, that is one sort of bargain. When they then write home that they discovered an unknown ruin in unclaimed jungle, that is theft performed in ink. Because writing lasts, ink can be more enduring than swords. A people can survive one raid and still lose the story of themselves to foreign pens over time. This too Chult resisted. Even the simple persistence of local names matters here. Mesro remained Mesro. Ubtao remained Ubtao. The Peaks of Flame remained the Peaks of Flame. Chultan organizations such as the Yatepka kept their own terms and symbols. Foreigners could misdescribe these things, but they could not wholly erase them. There is stubborn power in a name that refuses translation into someone else's convenience. Let me turn now to the matter of beauty. For Chult is beautiful, and beauty is dangerous to history because it tempts the teller towards stupor. One can describe the bright bays, the deep canopy, the river light at evening, the volcanic fire in the far mountains, the cries of beasts at dusk, the gem colors in market stalls, the golden dome of a sacred temple, the amphitheater with dinosaur statues, the smell of flowering plants and wet earth after rain. And all of that would be true. Yet beauty in Chult is almost always entangled with hazard or memory. A gorgeous valley may hold a forgotten atrocity. A jeweled city may have built its wealth on slave mines. A splendid harbor may have been taxed by a dragon turtle and later by profiteers. A temple founded by a god may stand at the center of a city nearly undone by civil war. A jungle clearing of astonishing serenity may sit on ground no one local will sleep upon after dark. Beauty there does not soften history. It illuminates it against darker stone. This is one reason Chult should never be narrated as merely grim either. To reduce it to horror is just another misreading. The land contains joy, festivity, color, trade, laughter, racing, performance, family life, devotion, and civic pride. Mesro's amphitheater hosted recitals and plays as well as the telling of lore. Port cities bustle with song, bargaining, celebration, and those irreverent practical pleasures without which no people remains human for long. Hunters return home, families eat, children mock foreigners expertly, priests pray, markets hum, the sacred and the ordinary coexist. What Chult denies is the luxury of separating these from danger. This denial may be why the place has endured so vividly in Faerûn's wider mind. Many lands can be idealized. Chult resists that by remaining too alive. It cannot be possessed cleanly by either romance or contempt. It is too storied for contempt and too dangerous for romance. What remains, if one is honest, is respect. Respect is rarer than admiration. Admiration often wants to take. Respect knows it may not. Let us bring tonight's theme back to the season's larger question. Who inherits the ruins? In Chult, this question becomes wonderfully inconvenient, because the answer is almost never singular. Take Mesro. To the faithful of Ubtao and those formed by Mesroan memory, it is sacred inheritance. To a foreign adventurer, it may appear treasure, lost lore, or a chance to become interesting enough for songs. To an imperial mind, it may look like a strategic site. To a zealot such as Ras Ensi, it can become an object of distorted love, a city whose holiness justifies domination. To monsters or opportunistic cults in later ages, the outskirts and remnants may become shelter or staging ground. To an archivist, it is also proof that a city can remain morally active long after outsiders declare it fallen. Take Omu. To the pious, it is warning. To the greedy, it is invitation. To the descendants of those once oppressed by its appetites, it is perhaps a grim satisfaction. To necromancers and liches in later ages, as we know too well, it becomes usable terrain precisely because moral collapse had already hollowed it for them. To the foreign treasure seeker, it is the most dangerous sort of ruin, one whose own history seems to promise that wealth lies within, and that the earlier inhabitants deserved what befell them. Such stories make plunder feel righteous. Take the lesser sites, the half-swallowed temples, abandoned riverworks, overgrown causeways, serpent-haunted stones, hidden shrines, and noble follies planted by foreigners who mistook a beach for destiny. Some belong legally to no one, practically to many, spiritually to the dead, strategically to whatever currently nests there, and morally to whoever remembers what happened. That is the Chultan inheritance problem in its most concentrated form. The jungle does not erase claim, it complicates claim. This is what bad maps cannot show. They can mark a ruin. They cannot mark whether entering it constitutes archaeology, sacrilege, reclamation, trespass, murder, or all of these in sequence. No wonder Chult kept needing guides. And now we come to one of my favorite subjects: guides. The guide is among the most underestimated political figures in Faerûn. Not the heroic guide of romantic travel literature, who exists to be admired briefly before the noble visitor does something foolish and survives anyway. I mean the real guide, the person whose knowledge converts an impossible landscape into a negotiated route. In lands like Chult, such people do not merely know trails. They know permissions, seasons, river moods, ruins that attract the wrong sort of curiosity. Sacred sites where loud foreigners should be slapped before they speak. Which clans may be approached directly and which through gifts, where undead have been seen recently, where predators den, how to read recent spoor, what color the water turns before flood, which local stories a foreign party ought hear if they are to behave, and which truths the same party must never be told, because greed would transform knowledge into disaster before nightfall. That is political power. Knowledge of route is knowledge of access. Knowledge of access is leverage over commerce, pilgrimage, plunder, diplomacy, and survival. Foreign companies and adventurers quickly learn they cannot do without local guides. Some respond with respect, others with patronizing dependency. The most dangerous respond by trying to replace guidance with ownership. Survey the route, post guards, extract the guide's knowledge, write it down in a foreign hand, then pretend the road belonged to the expedition all along. This maneuver is older than many kingdoms. Chult, blessedly, remained difficult enough to frustrate it often. The jungle forgets imposed certainties with admirable speed. Paths close, rivers alter, landmarks sink beneath growth, beasts reclaim, spirits object. What the foreign surveyor records in dry season may be nonsense in rain season. What the trader learned from one guide may get him killed when repeated elsewhere without context. The land itself sides, if not always with the local, then certainly against the arrogant. There is justice in that. This ecological difficulty helps explain why Chult's resistance to simplification remained so durable. A flatter land, a drier land, or a land more saturated with roads and metal infrastructure might have been absorbed more cleanly into foreign systems. Chult's very density acted as ally to local memory. It is harder to conquer thoroughly a place whose landscape keeps editing your conclusions. Again, do not romanticize. Ecological difficulty also harms the local. It raises transport costs, complicates coordination, magnifies famine risk when routes fail, and can isolate communities from one another. Yet, in the contest between local sovereignty and distant appetite, harsh landscapes sometimes serve as stern and unsentimental defenders. This leads to another question the episode must not avoid. Why does Chult matter so much to the wider history of Faerûn, if so many great powers never fully absorbed it? Because complete absorption is not the only measure of consequence. Chult mattered because it shaped trade patterns along the southern waters. It mattered because it stored precious goods that altered foreign behavior. It mattered because its sacred geographies and old cities entered wider rumor and aspiration. It mattered because it demonstrated a form of civilization many other realms could not easily categorize. It mattered because foreign commercial and colonial pressures revealed themselves clearly against Chult's resistance. It mattered because adventurers, scholars, missionaries, pirates, red wizards, merchant factors, and all the other mobile species of historical nuisance kept being drawn there, changed there, ruined there, or enriched there. It mattered because it preserved older layers of Faerûn in living relation rather than in sterile museum form. And perhaps most importantly, Chult mattered because it exposed a recurring fault in the realms: the inability of powerful states to imagine value without first imagining control. The Western and Northern habit has always been this: find a place rich in goods, old in memory, and difficult in terrain. Admire it, fear it, describe it as mysterious. Then begin asking who ought to regulate access. Very soon the sentence becomes, surely not the people already there, not entirely, not efficiently, not by our standards. And from that thought, all the old machinery begins warming. Chult answered by remaining itself as stubbornly as possible. This answer was never perfect. Foreign goods entered, foreign faiths entered, foreign stories entered. Local elites adapted in ways not always noble. Ports changed, merchant power rose. The very need to defend Chult's order produced secretive and coercive institutions of its own. Purity is for cosmologies, not histories. But survival is not the same as purity. Chult survived in form, memory, and difficulty. That is enough to deserve study. If you listen closely, you can hear how tonight's episode also prepares us for future ages. In later centuries, Chult will remain a place to which foreign factions, adventurers, necromancers, and seekers of dangerous power return again and again. Why? Not because it is empty, because it is full of old roads, old sins, old sanctities, old monsters, old gods, and old misunderstandings waiting for fresh victims. The present age will rediscover that with enthusiasm matched only by its lack of caution. We will return there in Season 3, and when we do, I expect you to remember that the so-called mysterious peninsula was already historically dense before the newest band of would-be legends packed insect repellent and set sail. For now, however, we remain in the long age of kingdoms and ask what the southern case teaches the whole season. It teaches first that inheritance is not always formal. Chult did not inherit a dead empire, in the neat way Cormyr inherits roads or Tethia inherits dynastic precedent. Instead, it inherited older sacred duties, ecological realities, tribal distinctions, serpent shadows, divine cities, internal wars, and the sea's continual insistence that wealth travels. Inheritance here is layered rather than singular. It teaches, second, that maps are instruments of power precisely because they decide what counts as visible order. A chart that shows a port and calls the interior wilderness is not merely incomplete. It is advocating future behavior. It teaches, third, that trade and colonial appetite are cousins who quarrel in public and share ledgers in private. One speaks of opportunity, the other of security. Both watch the same harbor with identical hunger. It teaches, fourth, that local perspectives are not optional embroidery on top of official history. They are the difference between history and inventory. And it teaches, fifth, that ruins within living homelands are among the most morally unstable objects in the realms. Who may enter? Who may interpret? Who may profit? Who may mourn? Chult forces these questions with exceptional sharpness. That is why I wanted this episode where it sits in the season. After Calimshan, Shun, Amn, and Tether, it would have been easy to keep following the familiar logic of states, councils, crowns, and merchant houses. Chult interrupts that momentum. It reminds us that the realms cannot be understood only through those forms. Some lands remain too sacred, too ecologically fierce, too locally plural, and too vulnerable to foreign misnaming to fit comfortably inside the categories empire prefers. Good. History needs places that resist the filing system. There is one final courtesy Chult demands from the historian. Do not mistake climate for character. Heat explains no civilization by itself. Rain is not a political theory. Vines do not create either virtue or vice, and neither do insects, volcanoes, or bright birds. These things condition life. They do not summarize it. Too many foreign accounts of the South become meteorology with adjectives. Chult deserves better. Its peoples made institutions, judgments, pieties, markets and mistakes under tropical skies, just as northern peoples made theirs under sleet and pine shadow. The weather alters the problems. It does not abolish the mind. Remember that whenever some overconfident traveler returns from the peninsula and tells you he has explained the place by describing how much he perspired. Sweat is not scholarship. So what should you carry from the stacks tonight? Carry this first. Chult is not a blank green shape at the bottom of someone else's map. It is a homeland dense with sacred obligation, internal history, political plurality, and maritime consequence. Carry this second. Mesro and Omu together reveal more about Chult than either one alone. One shows sacred urban order disciplined by covenant, education, memory, and guardianship. The other shows wealth decaying into slavery, appetite, and divine abandonment. A civilization deserves to be remembered in both its best articulation and its worst warning. Carry this third. The southern sea roads do not merely connect markets. They connect appetites, misconceptions, contracts, pirates, stories, hazards, guides, cargoes, and ambitions. They make Chult legible to outsiders in ways that endanger Chult, and they make outsiders dependent on Chultan knowledge in ways that frustrate their pride. Carry this forth. A map can tell the truth about distance and lie about meaning. Whenever you see a chart marking a place as empty, wild, lost, or unexplored, ask whose categories are being privileged and whose memories have been erased to make the label fit neatly in the blank space. Carry this fifth and carry it carefully because it applies far beyond Chult. To call another people's homeland wilderness is often the first soft violence before a harder one. What, after all, is required before a port becomes a colony? Not troops at first, not always. First, you need a story in which the place is underused, its people picturesque but politically insufficient, its ruins ownerless, its wealth waiting, its dangers exaggerated except when they justify intervention, its customs interesting but not binding. Once that story spreads, the rest becomes embarrassingly procedural. Chult knew this. That is why its watchfulness mattered. That is why its guides mattered. That is why local names, local gods, local societies, and local memories mattered. That is why the old map in my cabinet remains a useful little indictment. I find, the longer I endure, that one may judge a civilization by how it describes lands it wishes to profit from. The honest empire, if such a contradiction can exist even briefly, admits hunger. The dishonest one speaks of opportunity, light, order, or progress, while quietly sharpening invoices. Merchant powers do something similar with better accounting. Adventurers, alas, are not immune. Many a bold seeker of ruins has persuaded himself he serves knowledge when he serves only vanity with a pack horse. So I leave you with a handful of questions. When you hear a place called wild, do you ask whether it is truly without order or only without order recognizable to the speaker? When a ruin is found in a living land, who gets to name it found? When a guide leads a foreign party to a sacred place, who is using whom? When trade brings wealth to a port and danger to the interior, who pays the true tariff? And when a city like Mesro vanishes from easy reach, is that a tragedy for history, or a defense against those who have never learned to approach history with clean hands? Chult will reward whatever answer you bring with exactly the amount of mercy you deserve. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of the peninsula. Not merely that outsiders misread it, though they do. Not merely that trade corrupts, though it can. Not merely that sacred cities may fall or hide, though they have. The deepest lesson is that a land may remain itself even while being described badly for centuries. Description is not dominion. A chart is not a conquest. A rumor is not a census. A foreign chronicle may circulate through half the ports of the shining sea and still fail to touch the real pattern by which a people live. There is comfort in that for any student of history who has seen too many archives swollen with confident nonsense. The truth may be buried, it may be vine-covered, it may be guarded, fragmented, or spoken only in the right company. But it does not vanish merely because a louder story found better shipping. The archive at taleofthelich.com remains open to you. Shelves lit, notes arranged, timelines steadied, and the dust kept to a dignified archival level rather than the sort that suggests an understaffed institution or an over-enthusiastic necromancer. The website is live and growing. That pleases me. A proper archive should not merely preserve, it should also teach the living how not to repeat the more obvious mistakes of the dead, though admittedly the living are not always cooperative in this matter. Merch is coming soon as well. I continue to observe this phenomenon with the baffled tolerance one reserves for noble pageantry, migratory geese, and other persistent mortal customs. Still, if an object bearing the insignia of the hidden stacks helps carry old questions into new rooms, I shall endure the commerce with as much grace as can reasonably be asked of an oath-bound undead historian. There are worse fates than being commemorated on useful things. There are certainly more embarrassing ones. I have catalogued several. This episode was brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. For clear, durable, maintainable web design and development, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. If you require structures that can survive expansion, layered permissions, competing interests, and the inevitable tendency of human beings to add one more feature after solemnly promising they are finished, choose builders who understand that good systems are not merely attractive at launch. They remain intelligible when history begins using them. Next time, we turn northward. From the steaming green density of Chult and the southern sea roads, we will climb toward a very different kind of making. We will ask what the north looked like before it hardened into the familiar romance of tavern songs, frontier maps, and later legend. We will speak of Ilusk, Delzone's shadow, Uthgard memory, hard weather, hard roads, and the old truth that what later generations call wilderness often had prior claimants, prior roots, and prior names there as well. The North, like Chult, will punish simplification. It will simply do so with less humidity and more axes. Come prepared for wind instead of steam, for ruin among pines instead of ruin beneath vines, and for a frontier whose mythology has been polished by centuries of retelling until many listeners no longer notice where the romantic varnish begins. Until then, keep your candles trimmed, your maps annotated, your categories under suspicion, and your admiration restrained whenever a traveler describes another people's homeland as though it were a stage built for his self-discovery. I am Aurelian Cantonine. This has been the Lich's tale. And remember, ruin is not the same as forgetting. Forgetting begins when a coast is mistaken for a country, a port for a people, a commodity for a civilization, and a map's blank space for permission.